Everyone, this is the Amateur. Welcome to my channel. This is a channel where I kind of talk about a lot of things. I call myself the Amateur because I'm not a professional in any means, way to perform. I know some things about a lot of things, and so we're just here to have a conversation, have a discussion. So on today's episode, as I mentioned in the previous video, we're going to be talking about feminism. It's going to be in a series, and why I think feminism in and of itself is a horrible ideology and it should not be followed at all. So to begin, we're going to start off with what is feminism, because I think that's something important to define and understand as we move forward in this conversation. So I'm going to first start off by reading the Google definition, and this is probably what most people will agree that feminism in and of itself kind of stands for, and then I'll kind of go into the different waves of feminism. So feminism from Google is the advocacy of women's rights on the basis of the equality of the sexes. So that in and of itself is a horrible premise, and we'll get into that later. But first, to kind of explain feminism, so starting off with the first wave of feminism that was set to start in 1848 and that lasted until the 1920s with the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments from women. And essentially what I like to think of the first wave of feminism is that women are equal to men, and that was the basis of the principle. And it's a horrible one, and we'll get into that one later. But it held, this is coming from the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments from 1848, and it pretty much held that they felt that husbands had a tyranny in the household, that women didn't have the same right to vote as men had, that they need to go through suffrage. And that's really, it was more so about some of the initial legal obstacles of voting for women. The next thing that it held was that women are held to a higher standard of social expectations than men are, and they felt that was unfair. So that's essentially the first wave of feminism in a nutshell. The second wave of feminism is granted to be from about 1963 to 1980, and this is what I like to call that women don't need men. And so this is where you get the phrase that's coined, a woman needs a man like a bike needs a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle, which is, again, a totally untrue statement. Also during this wave of feminism, you'll see pushes for equal pay, pushes for abortion. So this is where abortion really started to take its stand. So changes and reform into the marital and legal court systems and family court systems and divorce, which a lot of it was unfounded in how it was gone for, but that's, again, another point. This wave of feminism also highlighted the rape culture, or the wave of domestic abuse and violence against women, from the violence of women from men. The third wave of feminism, which was about from 1990 to 2010, and I like to call this the women are better than men ideology of feminism, and this one is still a big continuation of reproductive rights, which we all know reproductive rights just means abortion, as well as a bit of the sexual liberation and the over-sexualization of, I don't want to say over-sexualization, but sexual liberation, women exploring their sexuality, and a lot of people don't really know how to define what this wave of feminism really was, but it was a wave. Of feminism, you start to see the takedown of the patriarchy, quote unquote. I don't think any feminist can really define what the patriarchy is. And then what you also see is the reclaiming of words, so like slut, B-word, I don't even like to say it, hoe, all of this stuff, trying to reclaim words. And just kind of as a side note, if a word originates as a negative connotation, there's no reclaiming the word. Like even with the N-word, I don't like saying it because I know that it originates in a negative light. And so it's one of those things where either it's okay for everyone to say it, or it's not okay for anyone to say it. And I'm on the side that it's not okay for anyone to say it. And if you think it's okay for just black people to say it, but not white people, then that is racist, actually. So again, I'm trying to help hold beliefs that are true for everybody, true across the board. So just a quick side note, there's no such thing as reclaiming a word, because people will use it and they will continue to use it in a negative light. And if you're not going to react kindly to when people say that you're a slut or say that you're an N-word, then you shouldn't want for anyone to say it. We get into the fourth wave of feminism, which I like to call what is a woman, because we've moved past the point where people don't even know how to define what a woman is. And then this is the movement where you see a lot of highlighting of marginalized groups and making sure that there's equal representation, still reproductive rights, all this other stuff of equality, which is just not the case. But to quote or to pull from Jordan B. Peterson that, you know, equity and equality is very much a feminine trait. And so we'll kind of I'll definitely get into that later. But those are essentially the four premises of the waves of feminism, and some may argue that there's a fifth one that we're in. But I think from the jump, you might hear some people say, well, I stopped my feminism after second wave feminism, or I stopped my feminism after the first wave of feminism. But I think the entire principle, the entire principle of feminism, I think, is corrupt and broken. And so all the waves kind of build off one another. And so I'm really going to be focusing on the first wave of feminism and why it was completely wrong. And so the first thing that I think it gets wrong is by saying that men and women are equal, because we know that we are not. We are equal in human value and worth, just as a man's human worth and value is equal to that of a baby, equal to that of a child in the womb. But we are not equal in function. And so one of the TikTok videos that I made, I like to reference our logic via mathematical equations, because that kind of helps us frame the translation, because again, the logic that you use in math is the same logic that you use anywhere else. It's 2 + 2 = 4, and if the math doesn't follow, then the logic doesn't follow, or what have you. So what I mean by men and women are equal in value, but are not equal in function, and that has to be acknowledged. A mathematical analogy would be men equals 5 times 5, and women equal 2 times 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 4. So both of those equal 25, but how you get there is completely different. And so to say that, I mean that both men and women offer different strengths and values to society as a whole, and that both of those strengths should be leveraged and not necessarily prioritizing one over another, because men and women are meant to complement one another. We're meant to build upon one another. But to say that men and women are equal, when we know that there are differences, biological differences that translate to different social measures, is not a good basis to form the principles, because what we get here is we want equality, quote unquote, by superior treatment of women than men. And that's kind of what you're seeing played out a lot today when you have the court system that heavily favors women than they do men of equal caliber, equal wealth, equal moral status and whatnot. And so that's why I first find fault with the first wave of feminism and how that is framed. Secondly, what it fails to acknowledge is that it wasn't just women who didn't have the right to vote, because there were women were allowed to vote prior to the suffrage movement, because votes wasn't necessarily sex-based. It was based on the household. It was based off property. So a lot of it definitely heavily favored the wealthy. So a lot of the poor men, white males, because again, blacks weren't really offered the ability to vote at the time, but even white males were disenfranchised in the system. It wasn't just males, just women, and there were some women who, if they had the property at the level of what it was meant to be, and they requested to vote because they were their own vote, they were allowed to vote. But the idea was that the man, the head of the household, and we'll get to this down the line, that they cast their vote on behalf of the family. And so a lot of women weren't trying to seek the right to vote because they knew that their husband was covering the vote that was best for the family. And again, single households of women, they were able to cast their own vote as well that was in their best interest. And so to frame the women's suffrage as solely a woman's problem of not having the right to vote is not entirely true. Additionally, what it does is it starts to break down the structure of the family. And this is kind of where I'll get into, again, kind of pulling from Jordan Peterson, but it's something that we see a lot, is the purpose of hierarchies, right? And so hierarchy means that something is better than another, or something is valued over another, or something has authority over another, but it's a ranking system in simplistic terms. And so what the tradition was, and what the tradition is in Christianity, is that God and Christ is the head, the man submits to Christ, the wife submits to her husband, and the children submit to their parents, in that order. And if everything within that order is followed correctly, your household is blessed, and it's living within the standards of what Christ calls us to live. And when any of that breaks down, whether it's with the man not following what Christ and what God orders us in treatment of the family, in treatment of the wife, in treatment of the kids, you get a breakdown in the family. Listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson, a lot of what feminism wants to do is destroy that hierarchy of the family, to level it out, to put everyone on the same playing field, but not in a way that is warranted. Because again, the voting system was based off the family, and not necessarily the individual in and of itself. But kind of going back to hierarchy is what I want to do, because what a lot of people, when I say people, I really mean feminists, what they like to do is say that in the hierarchy that means less than, which is not necessarily the case, and it's not what the Bible preaches, or what the Bible preaches, what Christ teaches us at all, but it's about a matter of authority. And so I come from a very strong military background. Grandfather served, father served, sister served, auntie served. So, and the military is all about ranking. And we know that the private, which is the lowest ranking soldier, is just as valuable as the general that's at the very, very top. And so kind of the way that I like to phrase it is that, God is the general. He is the top, the very, very top. He grants authority to man over the household, which is, as say, he's the colonel. And then you have the wife, who is the lieutenant colonel, a subordinate rank, still a very high rank, still profitable in its own right. And then the kids of the family, children of the family, are their privates, and they move up the ranks as they grow older. But when we talk about ranking and individual agency and responsibility, this is where a lot of feminists have problems with what God has ordered, or what the natural order is of submission. So to our military analogy, as a platoon leader, which is, kind of lower rank, but whatever. So as a platoon leader, a lieutenant, you are responsible for everything that your unit does or fails to do, regardless of whether you were the one actually executing the plan or executing the mission, right? So what that means is that if a soldier goes out and he drinks and drive, that falls back on the officer. It falls back on the lieutenant. The lieutenant did not go out and drink and drive, and it doesn't deprive the individual agency of that soldier for drinking and driving. Like that soldier will be punished accordingly, but it also reflects poorly on the officer. So maybe the officer didn't do a good briefing, didn't show that he cared enough, didn't show XYZ, and it's negatively looked on from higher. And this goes all the way up the chain. So this is something that is called extreme ownership, which is a book from, I think, some retired Marines, Leah Fabin and Jocko Willink. It's a really extraordinary book. Recommend. It's a good read. I don't vouch for it as a end-all be-all, but it's definitely a different way of looking at leadership. But the point of the matter is, extreme ownership is taking responsibility of everything that unit does or fails to do. And likewise, if your father, if the father is the head of the household, he is also responsible for everything that the unit does or fails to do. And that is the burden of manhood. That's the burden of being a man, granted by God to man alone, and that's not something that women can take away. But it's also not to relieve women of their own individual agency and their own individual responsibility. Because again, as the Bible tells us, every man is going to pay for their own works and not the works of others. That the son doesn't pay for the crimes of the father doesn't pay for the crimes of the son, etc. But it's a matter of responsibility and how that is appropriately ranked. And so we can even bring that all the way up to the higher top, which is God, and God being responsible for everything that we as humans do and fail to do. But he's taken that responsibility in sending his son Christ and offering us a way to salvation without us needing to do anything despite our flaws. And so I think it's a really beautiful synchronization of those beliefs, and we'll get to more of the Christian basis of feminism in the next video. But I just wanted to highlight that what feminism does is that it wants to destroy the hierarchy of the family, and you see it permeating down. So what it first does, and again we'll get into this in the second video really, is that it first kind of destroys the first link between man and God, because the feminist movement first of all starts off by a victim narrative, by trying to say that it's men's fault that we're not doing that we're not where we need to be, that we're not ahead of where we need to go. Women were not necessarily prevented from working, just a lot of women did not want to work if their man was doing just fine with their household, and they were perfectly fine just being those housewives, taking care of the children, raising the children. Some other women didn't understand what marriage is, and that's really like another series. But the point of the matter is that feminism kind of breaks down that first structure, and then it tries to put women, or not women, but the wives on the same lining as the husband, and that's just not meant to be the case. It's just not meant to be the case, and I'll go into that further in the next video. But then, so the next step, though, as you can see, is putting children, again, because again, family is all about hierarchies, and feminism is about flattening that hierarchy, so putting everyone equal. So you see that now permeating with the transgender ideology and the sexualization of our children, by saying that children have the right to override their parents' rules, their parents' household, to be able to have this gender-affirming medications and surgeries without the parents' approval. All this stuff about kids in school being able to do stuff without their parents' control. So pretty much trying to start treating children like they are adults when they are not. And their innocence and purity of the children is what needs to be protected, so that they transition into adult life without trauma and problems that a lot of the people on the left have faced. So I think that covers everything that I wanted to on the first, on feminism in and of itself. I think it's a horrible ideology, and again, it goes a lot deeper than the surface. Oh, and the last thing is that first wave feminism, again, was only about white women. So let that tell you something about what they truly cared about at the time. It was never a woman's problem if it was something they were concerned about, as far as with individual women having the right to vote. Just as slavery wasn't the black man's problem, it was never the black man's problem. It was a problem of humanity. It was a problem of how we treated people. And if you're going to boil it down to just melanin and race alone, you're going to miss the bigger picture of the root cause of the problem. And so, not to take too long, I try to keep my videos under 10 minutes. I don't have that many followers. But that's my first initial take on what feminism is and why its whole ideology is atrocious. And you'll see a little bit more in the next video if that's something that you're willing to listen to. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, share, and I'll see you in the next video.